All right. So, welcome to the second module for Chapter 8, where we are now going to focus on the heart and the two systems that are in the circulatory system. So, the pulmonary system and the systemic system. What we're going to first focus on, though, is the heart itself and the structures within the heart, and then how the blood flows through the heart. And then once we understand that, we'll add the different circulatory system pathways to our diagram to help you understand how blood moves through the body. Now, looking at the heart here, whenever you look at an image of a heart, 99% of the time it's going to be as if the person was in the anatomical position, right? So if the person was, excuse my great stick figure, facing like this, right? Remember, fingers, thumbs down, fingers, right? So the heart would be in this person, right? Just like that. So if we are looking at it in this orientation, then this is the left side of the heart, and this is the right side of the heart. Okay. Now, the heart has four different chambers, and you would have been able to dissect a cow heart if we were, doing face-to-face labs, which is really unfortunate because it's really good to see the structure in person, just so you can kind of get a feel for how everything looks, because it doesn't really follow the images to a T in a lot of the cases, especially because, like we see in this image, the atriums are collapsed and they're not ballooned open. And so the atriums look much, much smaller relative to the ventricles. Okay? And so you have your right atrium, your right ventricle, your left atrium, and your left ventricle. Okay? And then up here you have your aorta. Where's it at? This looks like it would be the superior vena cava, etc. And so what we're going to do is now we're just going to look at an artist's figure of the different parts of the heart. And I'm going to kind of go over which ones you really need to focus on, because there are maybe one or two that you don't have to worry about. So with the heart structure, if you were given a figure, the structures you need to know are the superior vena cava, the pulmonary artery. Okay, so that is a left and right pulmonary artery, right? Because you have a left and right lung. The pulmonary semilunar valve, which is right here. This valve is a one-way valve that allows blood to move into the pulmonary artery from the right ventricle. Your right atrium is this structure here. The right AV valve, which is this valve here, it's another one-way valve. It only allows blood to move from the atrium to the ventricle and not back into the atrium. You have your inferior vena cava. Okay, so the vena cavas bring blood to the heart from the body. You have your superior vena cava, so superior is above, right? And then inferior vena cava, inferior is below. Okay. You have the aorta, which is this vesicle here, or not vesicle, but vessel. And this is carrying blood to the body. So blood will leave from the left ventricle, go through this valve, which is the aortic semilunar valve, will go behind the pulmonary artery and out the aorta. Okay. Clear some of this drawing off. Okay. So then you need to know the pulmonary trunk, which is this structure here, right? So it's the main um, vessel that splits into the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery. Okay. You have your left atrium, which is the is the atrium on the left side of the body. You have your left atrioventricular valve. Again, is another one-way valve that allows blood to move from the atrium to the ventricle. And you have your left ventricle down here. And then we have the aortic semilunar valve, which we've already mentioned. Again, one-way valve. Okay. Now, the other parts of the heart, you have your septum, which is this middle muscle here, separating the ventricles. You have the outer tissue layer of the heart there, which is the epicardium. This thick muscle layer here is a myocardium. So the septum that separates the ventricles is made up of that myocardium. And then you also have a thin tissue layer that lines the ventricles, which is the endocardium. Okay. And then we also have papillary muscles and the chordae tendineae. And so papillary muscles are kind of the muscles here, and then the chordae tendineae is kind of what holds the valve in place. You generally won't be asked those on our exams. We'll mainly be focusing on the major structures. Okay. And so the way, right? So now that we've talked about these structures, I kind of want to go through how the blood is going to flow through the heart, right? And so you have blood coming in through the vena cava, the inferior and the superior. That brings it into the right atrium. Okay? The right atrium will contract and push that blood through the right AV valve into the right ventricle. The right ventricle will contract, push the blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, and then into the left pulmonary artery and the right pulmonary artery. And then this will take the blood to the lungs. Okay. Now, once the blood returns from the lungs, so it's oxygenated, it returns from the lungs with oxygen via the pulmonary veins. So you have your left pulmonary veins here, you have your right pulmonary veins there. This brings the blood into the left atrium. Okay. So now the blood is oxygenated. The left atrium will contract, will go through that AV valve, the left atrioventricular valve, into the left ventricle. That left ventricle will contract. Your blood will be pushed through the aortic semilunar valve and into the aorta, where it then will travel to the rest of the body. And then that oxygen will be dropped off, carbon dioxide will be picked up, and then it will return from the body back to the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. So that's the general flow of our circulatory system. Okay? And so that figure can be a little kind of jumbled up, hard to kind of see. So one thing I also like my students to do is to draw the circulation by memory. And a little kind of drawing that I've come up with that's pretty helpful is to draw a square and divide it into 4 chambers. This square is representing the heart. Okay, and I'm going to put an AV valve here, and then an AV valve here. Okay, because these top chambers are your right atrium and the left atrium. Okay, the bottom chambers are the right ventricle and the left ventricle. So that means this valve is the right AV valve. This is the left AV valve. Okay. Then what I like to do is draw my semilunar valves. So this is the pulmonary semilunar, and then this is the aortic semilunar valve. Then you have your superior vena cava, your inferior vena cava, all right, sorry about that little kind of glitch. My screen sharing stopped. So you have your superior vena cava, and then you have your inferior vena cava. Okay, and what we can then draw, right, is the arrows and how this blood travels through the body. So it comes in through the superior into the right atrium, through the right AV valve, into the right ventricle. Then it will go through the pulmonary semilunar valve, out of the pulmonary trunk, right? And then remember that splits. And so that will then go to the right pulmonary artery and then the left pulmonary artery. Okay? And then that will travel to your lungs. Okay? Then that will and so now you have oxygen in the blood. Okay, and so they come back through the pulmonary vein. So you have your right pulmonary vein, your left pulmonary vein, into the left atrium, through the left atrioventricular, into the left ventricle. And that's pumped through the aortic semilunar valve, and then it goes out of the aorta. Okay, that goes to the body, becomes deoxygenated, and then re-enters the heart. Okay, so you can try to draw it complex like this once you've got it down, but kind of an easier way. Hold on one second. Okay, so what would be like a more simplistic way is to just draw your squares, right? Your different chambers, okay? And then just draw the flow. Generally, whenever you see diagrams, most often if you see blue colors, it means there's no oxygen. And if you see red colors, it means there is oxygen. So what you can do is just draw it that way, right? So you have blue coming in, going through, going down, right? And we can put our valves here so we just know. Right? And we can do right atrium, left ventricle, right ventricle, left atria, left ventricle, our valve, okay? And then just kind of draw the flow, right? So right atrium, AV valve, right ventricle, pulmonary, semilunar, out to the lungs. Then when it comes back from the lungs, has oxygen, right? And then that goes into the left atrium, the left AV valve, into the left ventricle, and then out the aortic semilunar valve, and into the body. Okay. And then when it goes to the body, it drops off all that oxygen, so it's deoxygenated. Okay. And then it comes back, let's draw it here, okay, to the right AV, or the right atrium. Okay. So you can start out simplistic, and then you can work your way into filling in all of the different components, the different veins, the different arteries, labeling all of the different valves. And so you want to be able to identify all of these structures. Okay. And to me, drawing it like this is the best way to study. But your brain may think differently, and so just do whatever works best for you, I guess I could say, or should say. Okay. And so now, kind of going into it, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly because we've already talked about this. I'm just going to mention some of the things and names that we haven't mentioned so far, but we pretty much went through all of this as we kind of went through these figures. So the heart is a muscle. It's mostly muscle. It has some blood vessels. It has fat that surrounds it, but it's mostly cardiac muscle. Okay? And it's surrounded by a fibrous sac that we call the pericardium. That pericardium, it anchors the heart in place, and it also protects it. And as we've already mentioned, there's 3 layers of the heart. You have that epicardium, myocardium, and endocardium. So epicardium is on the outside of the heart. The myocardium is that thick layer of cardiac muscle that separates the chambers, the septum, and then with also that thicker layer here. And then the endocardium is a thin layer of endothelial tissue that is on the inside of, say, the ventricles, right? So it's continuous with the lining of the blood vessel. So it actually leaves the chambers of the heart and runs and continues into the blood vessels themselves. Now, as we mentioned, the heart has 4 chambers, 2 atria, 2 ventricles, so right and left for each. It has a septum that's separating the right and left sides of the heart. And then it has 4 different valves that help to prevent the backflow of blood. So when your blood's moving from the atria to the ventricles, you have the AV valve. So you have the left and right AV valves, but they have a particular name. So the right AV valve is the tricuspid. The left is the bicuspid, or also the mitral valve. And then you have the semilunar valves, which go from the ventricles to the vessels. So you have the pulmonary valve, and then the aortic valve. Pulmonary valve is in the right ventricle, aortic valve is the left ventricle. Okay. We also have a little animation to kind of go through that circulatory system and blood flow as well. Oh.
Humans have a four-chambered heart and two essentially separate circulatory loops. One is the pulmonary circulation, in which blood flows between the heart and the lungs. The other is the systemic circulation, in which blood circulates between the heart and the rest of the body. Blood that is loaded with oxygen is carried from the lungs to the left atrium, then to the left ventricle to be dispersed to the tissues of the body. Blood depleted of its oxygen is returned to the heart through the vena cava and then to the right atrium and ventricle, where it's sent back to the lungs to be oxygenated again. The exchange of materials between the blood and tissues occurs in the smallest blood vessels of the body, the capillaries. In the pulmonary capillary bed, the deoxygenated blood cell loads oxygen and unloads carbon dioxide. In the systemic capillary bed, oxygen is delivered to the tissues, and carbon dioxide waste from the tissues enters the bloodstream. The vertebrate heart is a muscular pump that provides the force needed to circulate the blood. The human heart has four chambers, two atria, singular atrium, and two ventricles. The atria are thin-walled chambers of muscle that receive blood returning from the lungs and body, and the ventricles are thick-walled muscular chambers that generate the force to pump blood to the lungs and the rest of the tissues of the body. The right atrium receives oxygen-depleted blood through two veins called the inferior and superior venae cavae, singular vena cava. When the atria contract, blood in the right atrium is forced into the right ventricle. The right ventricle receives blood from the right atrium and, on contraction, sends this deoxygenated blood to the lungs. The left atrium receives oxygenated blood from the lungs through two veins called the pulmonary veins. The pulmonary veins are the only veins that carry oxygenated blood. When the atria contract, blood in the left atrium is forced into the left ventricle. The left ventricle has the thickest walls of the four chambers. It receives the oxygenated blood from the left atrium and, on contraction, sends it through the aorta to all the tissues of the body. The blood is prevented from flowing backward into the chambers by a system of flap-like valves. The four chambers of the heart alternate between contraction and relaxation in a concerted fashion. This pattern is called the cardiac cycle. A cardiac cycle consists of one complete diastole, the relaxation or expansion phase, and one complete systole or contraction phase. At the start of diastole, the heart muscle is relaxed and blood flows into the atria. Toward the end of diastole, both atria contract simultaneously, followed about a tenth of a second later by the ventricular contraction. Atrial contraction at the end of diastole helps to fill the ventricles with blood immediately prior to the systole, the phase of the cardiac cycle during which both ventricles contract simultaneously. Step by step, the cycle works like this. Diastole begins when the atria relax and blood flows into the heart. Veins that carry deoxygenated blood from the body fill the right atrium. The left atrium is filled by the pulmonary veins, which carry oxygenated blood from the lungs. The atria are now filled with blood, while the ventricles are still relaxed. Some blood flows passively from the atria to the ventricles at this time. The atria contract, forcing blood into the relaxed ventricles. After contraction, the atrial valves prevent the backflow of blood from the ventricles to the atria. Next, the atria relax and the ventricles contract. Deoxygenated blood is pumped out of the right ventricle into the pulmonary arteries and carried to the lungs, while oxygenated blood is pumped out of the left ventricle through the aorta to the rest of the body. Upon relaxation, the pulmonary and aortic semilunar valves prevent the backflow of blood from the exiting blood vessels to the ventricles. One cardiac cycle is completed in less than 1 second. Blood pressure varies according to the cardiac cycle. The diastolic blood pressure is the lowest pressure, occurring during ventricular relaxation. The systolic blood pressure is the peak pressure, which occurs during ventricular contraction. A stethoscope and sphygmomanometer are routinely used to measure diastolic and systolic pressure. The different sounds heard through the stethoscope, called Korotkov sounds, correspond to the contraction and relaxation of the heart. The cuff is first inflated so that it compresses the brachial artery. The pressure in the cuff is slowly released, and as it descends, it reaches a point where blood is able to spurt through the constricted artery only at the moments of highest blood pressure. This pressure at which tapping sounds are first heard is the systolic pressure, the blood pressure when the heart is contracting. As the pressure in the cuff continues to drop, a point is reached where the sounds disappear. The blood is now flowing continuously through the brachial artery. The pressure in the cuff when the sounds first disappear is the diastolic pressure, the blood pressure when the heart is relaxing. Blood pressure is reported in fractional notation, with systolic pressure as the numerator and diastolic pressure as the denominator. For example, a normal blood pressure might be 120/80 millimeters of mercury.
Okay, so that video, that animation summarized the flow of blood through the heart. And it also kind of went ahead a little bit and talked about blood pressure and how the contractions in the heart work. Now, we'll pick up on this in the third video, I believe, where we will go through that process in a little more detail. Okay. And so that's it for the second video. In the next video, we'll start off by talking about the two circuits in the circulatory system. And then, excuse me, we'll start looking at the blood pressure, and we'll finish up with the diseases of the blood or the blood vessels and the heart as well. Okay. And so with that, we'll see you in the next video.